Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, those who are in person and those who are joining us on our live stream. I want to welcome you to today's program, Growing Up X. So we're going to learn all about Generation X. For those of you who are Xers like me, this is a story about us. Before we get started with the program, I do want to let everyone know that this program is being live streamed, and a special thank you to our live stream sponsor, WGLT, Bloomington Normal's public media, part of the NPR network. We're so thrilled that they are sponsoring another year of live streaming for the museum so that we can continue to reach beyond the walls of our building with our programming. And also for those who are in person, just a reminder, being live streamed, being recorded, so mind your P's and Q's. If you don't want it said over the internet, don't say it in the room. But we are pleased to welcome Erica Holst, who is the Curator of History at the Illinois State Museum, and she was the curator of the Growing Up X exhibit, which explored the toys, technology, and cultural touchstones that shaped Generation X. Side note, yours truly's stereo system was on display in that exhibit while it was in Springfield, so this exhibit holds a special place in my own heart too. And in addition to having worked in public history field for more than 15 years, Erica is a graduate of Illinois Wesleyan University and also a former McLean County Museum of History intern as well. So we are thrilled to have her back for her program today on Growing Up X.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm glad to be here. I appreciate people who showed up in person and are joining us online. As Candace mentioned, this talk comes out of an exhibition that was recently in Springfield, Illinois called Growing Up X, where we explored the toys, technology, and cultural touchstones of the most overlooked generation in American history, Generation X, those born between 1965 and 1980. That exhibit has since moved to our Lockport, Illinois gallery, so if anyone is so inclined, it's a little bit of a drive now, but it is still on view, so you can see it through June of next year. Before I get underway, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Illinois State Museum. Can I get a show of hands? Has anyone been there? Awesome, cool. We've got some people who've been and some people who have yet to have the pleasure, but I hope you'll pay us a visit. We are located on the Capitol Complex in Springfield, Illinois. The museum covers history, art, natural history, sciences, anthropology. There's a little bit of everything. We always have rotating exhibits, and there's also a lot of research that's going on behind the scenes. Best of all, the museum is open 7 days a week, and there's free admission. So if you're ever in Springfield and have some time to kill, I hope you will come and pay us a visit. And then I also want to tell you a little bit about me. What does a history curator do? My job is to care for and develop the collection of history artifacts that the museum holds. Currently there's about 20,000 artifacts, and so I do things like curate exhibits, add to the collection and help to fill in some gaps in our interpretation, give talks like these, work with our educational programs. So basically my job is telling stories with objects, which is really fun, and I feel quite lucky. So again, here's our title screen from Growing Up X. This was on view in Springfield from January until October of last year. It's now in Lockport. And the purpose of this exhibit is to really dive into this generation who are now, I'm a member of it, we're now middle-aged, and there's a lot of influences that surround you in childhood that you just sort of absorb. You know, as kids, you played with what was being played with at the time, you watched what was on TV, you kind of got a sense of world events in the news, and it seeped into you and made an impression, but it's not until later on when you look back and reflect that you can really kind of analyze the place you were in history and the context surrounding you and how that shapes the people that we are today. I think that's instructive both as a lesson in self-reflection for those of us who are Gen X, and also for younger folks who want to know, like, why are your parents the way they are today? Well, this is how they grew up and what kind of molded them. So the content of our exhibition was formed by a survey that we sent far and wide. This was something of a challenge for me as a history curator, because typically if I do an exhibit, like the one previous was 19th century fashion, then it's time to like go to JSTOR and crack open the books and get into the manuscripts, and you're reading about a history that's past and people who are now dead and trying to reconstruct their experiences. Gen X is still alive, arguably in our prime, and so the task is to kind of try to distill the experience of 65 million people who are alive and well and very diverse into something that resonates across a broad swath of people, but also you know, has enough commonalities that we all kind of can relate to, you know, having been there. And so we sent out this survey that had questions like, you know, are you Gen X? Where did you grow up? What TV did you watch? Were you a latchkey kid? What kind of clothes did you wear? Just tried to cover all the bases, put it out there and hope for the best. And my director had said to me, how many responses do you think we'll get? And I said, like, you know, if we get like 50 to 100, I think we'll be doing okay. We got 1,000 back. So we got a really nice sample and just really great memories and insights and reflections. And so the content that you see that I'll share with the exhibit comes directly out of these surveys. It's not like me trying to, you know, speak for 65 million people. We really tried to call, you know, when we interpreted toys, it was the toys that were mentioned most in the surveys or the news events that really like were mentioned most frequently. And so I like to think we did a decent job of, you know, hitting on kind of a core experience that, you know, whether you lived in an urban area or rural or, you know, what ethnicity or race you might be, there were some things that were kind of like central to us all. And so the exhibition includes a discussion of technology, a discussion of music, toys, fashion, the essence of being a latchkey kid, which I'll start off with here in a minute, and then some heavier topics that were kind of historical, cultural surrounding us, like the Cold War, the AIDS crisis, and just say no to drugs. This was my absolute favorite part of the exhibition. We created a 1980s rec room, and we wanted people to really be able to experience what life was like in the 1980s. And so one of the challenges in the museum field today is how to get people involved. And kind of the trend is to go digital, and unfortunately the State Museum's tech person retired. He has not been replaced. Like we are way behind the 8 ball when it comes to being like hi-fi and digital. So we went the complete opposite direction and went completely lo-fi and analog, but also like opened it up. We put everything in there was appropriate to the time period, and then no restrictions. You know, you can touch whatever you want, sit on, use, and we did this knowing that some things might wind up broken or stolen, and just, you know, that's something we figured we'd have to deal with. And it turned out to be a huge hit. People loved it. I wish it was still there, because I would go on my breaks and just kind of sit down on the ugly couch and play a round of Super Mario Brothers 2 for a couple minutes. So talking about Gen X, who is Generation X? They are the roughly 65 million people born between 1965 and 1980 is the standard definition. Of course, there's a little bit of wiggle room on either end, especially if you grew up in a family that happened to have, like, you know, you're born in the early 60s, but you have younger siblings, or you were born in the 1980s but have older siblings. You kind of like gravitate towards the generation that like your family was. But this generation is wedged between the baby boomers and the millennials, and we have like disappeared off the cultural radar. Like still today, people forget about Generation X. I've seen graphics on the news that are like, this is what boomers, millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, you know, it's just forgotten. And one of my favorite tweets that went around was like, it's like someone parked Gen X in front of the TV 40 years ago and forgot about us. And the thing is, you know, kind of prefer it that way as well. So we've been called the MTV generation, the slacker generation, the forgotten generation, and the latchkey generation. And one of the distinguishing features about this generation is that its size. The generations on either end have about 72, 73 million people, so this is a smaller, like numerically, generation and easier to kind of like fall by the wayside. So I want to dig into that nickname of the latchkey generation. Was anyone in here a latchkey kid by any chance? Okay, do you want to tell me about what your experience?
I had a house key that I wore around my neck.
Yep.
Also,
Classic.
yeah, my parents left for work. I was supposed to get myself. Whoops. Hello. I only work here. Even I don't follow the protocols. Must be a Gen X thing. So yeah, I was a latchkey kid, had the key around my neck, and was responsible for getting myself to the bus stop. And when I got off the bus, opening the house, nobody was home yet. My brother was at a different school. My parents were both at work, and that seemed perfectly normal.
And how old were you when you started coming home alone?
I was 7.
Wow. Yep. And that was what you did, right?
And my daughter, who is 9, can't seem to be on a floor of the house without someone there with her. So it's very different.
It is very different. Yeah, absolutely. And Candace, did you want to add to that?
So I had the farm experience, and
Okay.
so Dad was out in the field a lot, and I would be, home just hanging around the farm by myself, and that was probably maybe starting around when I was like 10 or 11 or so, because a lot of times like a grandma would come and get me too, or I'd go to a grandma's house, but then when I got to that point, they're like, she's fine inside and running around the farm, running down the creek, anywhere, she's okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. So that's the latchkey phenomenon is one that as kids you're like, okay, here's my key, I guess I'm letting myself in. And it's something that in hindsight you can unpack. It's like, wait, why were they leaving a 7-year-old at home alone? And it turns out to be like really this confluence of social and historical forces that landed square on the heads of this generation of children. So like in no particular order, one of them is the rise of no-fault divorce. So starting after the 60s, you have kind of the sexual revolution, the summer of love. You've got a very prosperous time in the wake of World War II. And so people's material needs are being met to a degree exceeding what they had been in the past. This isn't to say that everyone's living the dream, but in general, it's a prosperous time. People are getting a little bit more like cerebral and reflective, and hence the sexual revolution and ideas of relationships and the idea that like a marriage isn't just an economic unit or something you stay in for the sake of the kids. It begins to be more about like personal fulfillment and finding that romantic soulmate, and if that didn't happen for you, then it's okay to divorce and start again. The no-fault divorce means nothing's like egregiously wrong with your marriage, it's just not working out and maybe you'd like to be married to someone else. And so the divorce rate actually spiked in America between 1960 and 1980 and has since fallen. There's not as many divorces now as there used to be, but that 1960 to 1980 happens to be like just when Gen X is kids. So now all of a sudden you have these children who have parents who are split, and that often means a dad that you see on the weekends or every other weekend, a mom who is now a breadwinner of the household who has to go out and work to supplement her child support or alimony that might not be enough to, maintain a household. And the kids are just kind of, in the middle there. You also have kind of, especially towards the 1970s, that economic boom starts to decline. You have more outsourcing, and to maintain a middle-class standard of living, all of a sudden is taking 2 incomes where it used to take 1. So you have moms entering the workforce for economic reasons that way. And then you also have, in the wake of 60s revolutions, the women's liberation movement, more women joining the workforce as an avenue for personal fulfillment, and because they can and because they want to. to. So all these converge to take mom out of the house. But what happens is like daycare lags way behind. Like when I was a kid, daycare was not a thing. When my son started school, they were like, oh, there's an after school program. He can hang out in the cafeteria until 5 when you can pick him up. And that's a great idea. They do that, you know. Just in the 70s and 80s, maybe you had a neighbor who could watch your kids, or if not, you get the house key around your neck, and it's little kids, you know, 5, 6, 7, who are being sent home and made to, you know, hang out on their own. And so what's that experience like? I would say that sense of like not being watched is, if you had to define a core experience for Generation X, that's it, that sense of independence. My mom was home with me. She was a stay-at-home mom, but she wasn't that like into playing with me. Like I remember her watching soaps in the afternoon and like drinking tea, and me being on my bike like out and about and doing God knows what, you know. There was just a lot less parental oversight. And so on the one hand, I think it built a very independent generation, you know, a very like pragmatic, we can figure this out because we have to. There were all those memes that floated around during the pandemic, like Gen X was born for lockdown, right? Like we can sit and entertain ourselves until the end of time. That's totally fine. On the other hand, there's a like knife's edge of like independence and freedom and like terror when it comes from not having parents there, because that means like the guardrails are off. And one of the things that showed up in our surveys was a lot of like, it was great, I went home and played Atari and, you know, ate Kool-Aid out of the package and it was fun. But there were also things like, you know, I was lonely, I didn't feel cared for, or this person, well, that person enjoyed themselves. We had people talk about their house being broken into, and they had to take their dog and hide in the shed while there's a burglar in their house, or, you know, someone bullied them on the way home from school, and they get home and they're home alone and nobody's there to care for them. So it's really the sense of like, someone should be watching these kids and there's not, and if everything's fine, great, but things have the potential to go like really wrong too. And I think that kind of like seeps into a generation as well, like fine, you know, we will figure it out, and you weren't there for us when we needed you. So what do Gen Xers do when they get home from school? They flip on the TV and watch TV. Who remembers Saturday morning cartoons? Yeah, because there was a pattern to, you know, the television. Like there was, I remember in the afternoons there being like shows in syndication. Remember, there's like not enough TV content, so they would rerun the old shows. I can remember watching things like Mr. Ed or Leave It to Beaver that I wasn't that into, but you know, it's TV, so I might as well watch it. But Saturday morning cartoons were like the time for kids when it's like you and your time. Because of course in the evening it's like the primetime dramas and the parents take the TV over again, and you might have the honor of sitting there and like changing the channel on the click, 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 click. So who had any of this in their household while growing up, remembering the setup? The TV with the click, click, click dial. We did not have a rabbit ear antenna, but we should have had one to really give the flavor of it. I can remember getting the cable box in the 1980s, which was like mind-blowing, but my parents didn't spring for like the expensive cable like HBO, but my friends' parents did, so you go to, you know, whoever has HBO and you watch their programming all the time. I can remember my dad bringing home the VCR and like posing with a picture of it in 1986. This is like huge purchase that changed our lives. And I had forgotten that the VHS industry, normally videos were priced at about like $100 when they came out, and hence the like rental stores, like that's why you rented instead of just buying them yourself, because they were like kind of unaffordable. So getting back to those cartoons, I'm going to take us on a little trip down memory lane. Oops, did I click past it? Just for nostalgia's sake.
And the masters of the universe. I am Adam, Prince of Eternia and defender of the secrets of Castle Grayskull. This is Cringer, my fearless friend. fabulous secret powers were revealed to me the day I held aloft my magic sword and said, "By the power of Grayskull!" Cringer became the mighty Battle Cat, and I became He-Man, the most powerful man in the universe. Only 3 others share this secret. Our friends, the Sorceress, Man-at-Arms.
Okay, we get the idea. Yeah, I found that ad, you know, the power that separates the men from the toys, and it's like, there is so much to unpack there, starting with toxic masculinity. But there is a difference to the Gen X toys. This is kind of the golden age of like weird toys, like He-Man and you know, Gem and the Care Bears and everything. This is a departure from the way that toys, you know, typically were in the past. For many generations prior, toys still like had a kind of instructive element to them that were meant to prepare boys and girls for their future roles. So a woman might be given a doll to help her, you know, develop her maternal instincts, or a tea set to practice being a hostess, and a boy might get a building set to learn how to build and things. And those things are still here in the 70s and 80s, but they also got really weird, you know? Like if you try to explain He-Man to someone, it's like, well, this big muscly guy wears furry underpants and battles a sentient skeleton, and it's like, what? You know, like we've gone down this like trippy, you know, fantasy world realm that parents couldn't really relate to, you know? They're like, okay, I guess if this is what you want. Another factor of the toy industry and how it showed up in our lives is the smallness of the demographic of Gen X. That means there's a smaller market share to sell toys to. So, you know, with a big plump generation, then you market toys traditionally at like Christmas time, right? And that's when a lot of toys happen. When you've got less kids, you need to be like selling more toys to make up that ground. So you see the spread of advertising of toys. And this happens to coincide with the Reagan era. So Mr. Deregulation, one of the things that he deregulated was the FCC, which before had pretty tight controls over how much advertising to kids could take place during the course of a programming. It was limited by a certain amount of minutes, and you couldn't promote products within the show. And, you know, deregulation, all of that is out the window. And so what you see here is this explosion of the toy industry, and they all had their cartoons that came with. And whereas previously in the past you might have like a successful TV show and then you do some tie-in like merchandising, like, oh, buy the lunchbox. Now you've got this toy that someone dreams up and they're like, oh, we need to sell this to kids. Let's make up a backstory in a TV show. So all these cartoons are basically 22-minute commercials, and they're meant to like model play, you know, here are some scenarios you can act out with their dolls. And they're always like making new friends, you know, or like getting new pets or getting new equipment, because in the toy stores, you know, the new friend would show up as a doll or another thing that you need to buy. So it was like this constant streaming, like buy toys that you're like steeped in from a very young age. So as we got older, the cartoons were replaced by another seminal thing in the lives of Gen Xers, so much so that we've been called the MTV generation. Another trip down memory lane. Did anyone actually see this?
We've gone for main engine start. We have main engine start.
Ladies and gentlemen, rock and roll.
This is it. Welcome to MTV Music Television, the world's first 24-hour stereo video music channel.
Does anyone remember what the first video to play was? Awesome, yeah. So did anyone watch MTV in the 80s? Yeah. What was your impression of it? Yeah, sorry, Candace. I'm making Candace run back and forth with the, yeah, no.
No, I was so addicted to MTV, I wouldn't leave the house sometimes. And I would videotape just shows and videos and watch them later because I didn't want to miss any of it. I mean, I was glued to that channel.
That's amazing.
It's pretty sad to think about now.
So what appealed to you about it?
Just, I don't know, I guess the music, mostly, you got to see so many different kinds of music.
Mm-hmm.
I hadn't really been experiencing a lot of that before. I mean, maybe that's it. Because that's what was keeping me there, is the music and what showed up, like what videos would show up. And you could see Madonna next to Talking Heads, next to Judas Priest, and you could see all this stuff. It was great. It had such a great variety. Now you really don't get that a whole lot.
It's true. Yeah, now we could like really focus into our niche interests. Did anyone want to add anything about MTV?
I had to go to a friend's house to watch it because we didn't have cable out in the country. So that's how I got my fix on MTV as a kid.
Was it kind of a treat when you saw it?
It very much was. I felt real special when I got to hang out at one of my friends' houses, and then I was just glued to their cable TV because that was like nothing I had at home.
Right. So it was completely a game changer on a lot of different levels. For the reasons that you pointed out, it did kind of open up music and our accessibility to music if you had a MTV subscription. But prior to that, on the radio, the majority of artists were like white men that were being played on the radio, and so MTV kind of opened up the field, like not right away. They were actually like a little bit slow to start playing artists of color, but they did get on board. And first we have Michael Jackson being a huge pop star, and then MTV Raps came out in the 1980s, and that's like, in like white suburbia where I lived, like rap music wouldn't have found its way there, but it did because of MTV. And then, all of us like white suburban kids are like completely into rap and really kind of spread through the country. I would argue part of it is like the visualness and the theatricalityness of it, like you're not just watching the music or listening to the music, you're seeing what they're wearing and like the production quality of the videos, and then you get your like flock of seagulls haircut or your Madonna laced gloves. Like it was really kind of like where you went to see what was new and cool in the world. And so let me see if I jumped into the Cold War. So just in terms of, is this playing again? Don't play. Just in terms of the like music of Gen X, that was another thing that like came through really, really strongly, was that music is like the heart and soul of Gen X, right? Like first there's what we consumed, in the 70s and 80s with the punk and the new wave and the pop, like the Madonnas. They're artists of an earlier generation, but they're making things for our consumption. And then as you get into the 90s, then you get like your grunge, which is like a product of Gen X, right? This culture that's growing up in the 90s, there's some like economic recessions. We're over Reaganomics, we're over capitalism and taking things in a new direction that has this entirely new sound that people really resonated with. And I have to admit, I've gotten to the point in my life where like I've stopped following new music or new artists, and like all my stations are set to like 90s music. It's like, okay, that's where I was like formed in the crucible of like music, and that's where I will stay. Oh, and we did have some quotes to share from the surveys. Growing up in small town Southern Illinois, MTV was a huge eye-opener for me. I would be exposed to people I would never meet there, be it black or gay people, and would learn so much more than I would in my own town. So yeah, the idea of like having your horizons broadened, and then the like 24-hourness of it. I can remember it, even if we weren't like watching, like just being in the background, and it was just kind of like the backbeat of your social life. They're about like 3 or 4 minutes. There were the exception. Thriller is like 10 minutes or something. Yeah. It was. Remember, they were like counting down until the release of it. It was like almost like a movie. Yeah. It did not disappoint. It still doesn't to this day. I've made my son watch it. So switching gears into something heavier, does anyone know what this feature film is or remember seeing it when it aired? Sorry, Candace.
Right. Missile warning, this is Beale. Confidence is high. I repeat, confidence is high. Roger, we've got 32 targets in track and 10 impacting points. Want to confirm, is this an exercise? Roger, copy. This is not an exercise.
Roger, understand. Major Reinhardt, we have a massive attack against the U.S. net at this time. ICBMs. Numerous ICBMs. Roger, understand. Over 300 missiles inbound now.
Come on, baby, don't die on me now. Oh.
You can name the movie. Yep. And basically took every American fear about nuclear war and like distilled it into one feature film and like played it for everyone. And I'm still like kind of scarred by it all these years later. So that brings us, of course, to a discussion of the Cold War. And this, from this man who wrote an article in Vanity Fair, really like said it like, yes, that's exactly how I remember it. The message was made clear to all of us. It could happen, and it could happen tomorrow, and you would be, oh, and your shadow would be burned into the ground somehow after you were vaporized. But the only thing worse than dying in a nuclear holocaust would be not dying in it and having to contend with its hellscape aftermath. Anyway, sleep tight. Does anyone remember, like, what the vibe was about the Cold War growing up? Yeah.
I was born a couple years before, so the early 60s, but I grew up in the basically was a kid in the 60s and 70s and in college in the early 80s. And I remember it vividly. I think often about the kind of existential crises that young people live with today, and remember that that was ours, really, that was one of them. And I remember ducking under in Southern California, we still had to go under the desks.
Oh, wow.
And bumped my head really, really hard and had a concussion, a bad concussion.
Oh my
But I
gosh.
wouldn't come out because I heard planes going overhead and assumed that that was the,
Wow.
but when the day after came out, I was in college and my mother was very, very active in the nuclear freeze movement. And that was one of the big movements, social movements on college campuses at the time too. So we were all glued to this movie. It was right before I met you, about a year before. And Not in the movie, yeah. But yeah, it was really, and watching that, it is my whole body, you could just feel it in my body, you know, that visceral response. It was really, it just hung in the, I don't want to say that, hung in the air. That's an unfortunate metaphor, but yeah, it was dramatic.
Yeah, that's an excellent point too about that being our generation's existential crisis. Now I would argue maybe it's climate change or, you know, any number of wars. Every generation maybe has theirs, but yeah. Does anyone else want to add? I remember the sense that the Russians were going to get us, you know. I didn't even know who the Russians were, but I knew that they were like ready to, you know, annihilate us at any moment. And yeah, it was that sense that it could happen at any second, you know, and you can't live and maintain in a perpetual state of like existential dread, like fearing for your life. So yeah, it does just kind of seep into you, and in some ways you get numb to it. And it's this weird dichotomy of like being constantly afraid, but then like just kind of learning to ignore it. And so the Cold War showed up. What we had in the exhibit was we had like the video cassette Red Dawn and Nintendo games where the Russians were the bad guys. It kind of like crept into popular culture, which is the way a lot of like kids experienced it. They experienced, you know, knowing that Russians were the bad guys, that they were going to nuke you, and, you know, like, but get on with your life. And so.
So when you hear the news that the Russians are having satellite interrupters, do you think this generation reacts differently to that kind of news than other generations?
It seems like a terrible flashback from the past. You know, we lived through it, and, you know, it kind of peaked in the 80s with the mutually assured destruction, and then the Berlin Wall came down, and we're like, oh, Cold War's over, you know, everything's great. Check that off the list of things to worry about. And then now, you know, following the news again in Russia, it's like, oh, I guess that wasn't resolved. Yeah, so it does seem like coming full circle in a lot of ways. And so we did get a lot of like poignant insight from our surveys off of that. Barbara says, we were supposed to die in a nuclear war. That's what we lived with, the constant fear of being obliterated in a nuclear blast. Nothing happened, and here we are struggling to retire, own a home, and continue on. And some of us never planned for the future because we weren't expecting one. And then Tandy says, I think we as a group are resilient and scrappy. We grew up thinking nuclear war was quite possibly going to wipe us all out, and we were thinking about Red Dawn survival scenarios as part of our regular thought process. And like that still like is deep in me, you know. I have a little closet, like you know, the like prepper movement where people like store up water and food and whatever. For a while I was like, oh, that's nuts. And I was like, but is it so crazy really? Like in this day and age, like, is it crazy to be prepared? So I have this little closet where I have like, you know, some food and lanterns and stuff. And my husband's like, how long do you think that's gonna last you? A week? What are you gonna do after that? And I was like, well, at least I'll have that week to figure it out. And then going into another thing that surrounded us as kids. Does anyone remember this ad?
This is your brain on drugs. Any questions?
Oh, I just did the short one. Yes, so we also grew up in the shadow of the war on drugs. And this started during and kind of in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Drug use became an issue both among soldiers returning from the war and people protesting the war. Neither of these groups were like, you know, Nixon was a big fan of, so he declared a war on drugs and called drug abuse public enemy number one and created the Drug Enforcement Agency. And so, you know, drugs kind of came to the forefront of the social consciousness as like, this is a big bad deal. It kind of, you know, there was a little bit of a lull under Jimmy Carter, and then in the 80s, of course, you had Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan. You had the spreading of the availability of crack cocaine in urban settings, and so then the Just Say No movement is born. And this is where I grew up, and kids are really like, this one really did a number on us because kids were like drafted into the Just Say No movement, right? Like there's all these public service announcements on TV. There's all these after-school specials where, you know, someone tried a hit of marijuana and wound up dead, you know, and it's this very dire messaging that's like, you know, all it takes is just one time and you'll be addicted and die and ruin your family's lives. And people struggling with addiction were kind of judged, you know, there was a real moral element, like it was something they were choosing to do and needed to be treated as criminals, not as people struggling with an addiction who needed treatment. And of course, this hit communities of color very hard, who were policed hard, who were disproportionately incarcerated. So there's all these levels down below, but as a kid, you're given a Just Say No button and you're told, you know, stay off of drugs if you want a good future, and you wear the button and you go to the rallies and, you know, kind of absorb it and become foot soldiers in this war against drugs. And it's only until later when you reflect back and you're like, really, you know, like, was that the best message? Like, are people living with addiction criminals? You know, do communities of color need to be incarcerated for having an ounce of marijuana on them? And so we can kind of like unpack that strategy, and I think, you know, the research has shown that it didn't really work. And clearly now we're in the throes of an opioid epidemic, and you just don't say no, just say no to that. We've retired that messaging, but still struggling with the problem of what to do with addiction in this country. And then now, you know, as a parent, in the 80s, we were told that if you know, tried marijuana, you would like die. It'd be the gateway drug, and, you know, the next thing you'd be homeless and like dead. Now that they're cutting recreational drugs with fentanyl, like you really can try it once and die, and it's scary for me as a parent. You know, it's like, well, not to like resurrect this old messaging, but really like don't take any pills or don't try anything because like this time it's real. You really could die. Maybe we like blew that messaging 40 years too early when we really needed it now.
See, I also remember a time in the later 80s when we were older, our teens, that there was just the opposite, that there was kind of a feeling of experimenting too. Not like quite as heavy as the 70s, but people were more mellow and they wanted to kind of experiment with a lot of different things. And so I kind of remember that being part of the 80s as well, not just the just say no, but just say, okay, let's try it.
Yeah, I think that Just Say No messaging had, you know, kind of like a opposite effect of what it was intended to. I don't have the quote in there, but we did have people say like, yeah, all this anti-drug messaging like told me which drugs, you know, did what and like what I should be trying, or, you know, just made me curious and want to try drugs more. So you're right, there was this background, you know, I've got, my sister-in-law was in college in the 80s. She's like, yeah, I tried cocaine. I was like, what? You know, but like there was a sense of like, you know.
I mean, it was just, I just knew a bunch of people, and it just didn't seem like that big a deal. And it was like, I don't know, nobody was getting caught for it. It just seemed, I don't know how to describe it. It was college age, and people were just kind of going with the flow and trying different things. And just, yeah, like you said, you know, finding out, oh yeah, we can try that too. You know, finding out from the Just Say No movement and everything like that. But.
Yeah, and I definitely think there were different experiences, you know, in certain demographics, you know, like white middle-class kids on a college campus are going to have a different experience with drugs than like, you know, inner-city black youth, unfortunately. And so, yeah, I think there were a certain segment of the population that was totally like, look the other way and excused from trying drugs. And so this is like classic Just Say No, and this was loaned to our exhibit, and then it was actually donated to us afterwards. We thought this was so great that we asked if we could keep it. Jenny Barker made this poster for a contest in 1989, and she actually won first place, and she spent her $100 prize money buying a Nintendo system. So we'll do a little bit of visual thinking strategies. Can someone tell me what's going on in this image here?
Your family is sad because you did drugs and you're dead now.
Yes, exactly. So yes, a very heavy-handed message, you know, like drugs have killed someone and like left their broken family to pick up the pieces. So again, this sense of like the direness of it, you know, trying drugs would be fatal. And then also like the element of guilt to it, you know, like look what you did to the people who love you. And Jenny donated this and said like, maybe someone should have sent me to a counselor. It's like, I don't know. And she said that the deceased, whose name's on the casket, Robert Kish, he died of dope. And she said, I didn't even know what dope was, but you know, I knew that it was bad, and so he died of it. And then, yeah, Ronnie D talks about her memory. She said, it seems like every show I watched had at least one very special episode about the dangers of drugs. We watched films in school and it was pounded into us how bad all drugs were. Marijuana was a gateway drug, and one hit off a joint meant you were going down a road of doom. I remember DARE and very punitive actions taken against people who used drugs. At the time I was terrified of all drugs, all of them. The Just Say No campaigns demonized all drugs, and that was not cool, especially now that I know that it was rooted in racism. So again, yeah, there's the message, and I didn't drink in high school. I definitely didn't do any drugs, and I remember like feeling not like it was a personal choice, but it was like this moral stand that I was taking, you know, like I'm on the side of like clean, sober living, and I really like looked down on my peers who, you know, were like going to parties and drinking because they were like being immoral, I thought, not just a personal. And so it's taken me a while as an adult to like unpack that. And then, you know, when marijuana became legal, it's like, what? Like, I spent my entire childhood being told that, you know, like one hit would be fatal, and now you can just go to a store and buy it. So yeah, it's a different time. Okay, and so one more thing that we lived through was the AIDS crisis. Or the human immunodeficiency virus. I remember this as Ryan White was the person I connected to as a child, because he was a kid and he, you know, got it through a blood transfusion, and it made me terrified. And then there was all the misinformation spreading around, right? Like, can you get AIDS from a toilet seat? Can you get it from a drinking glass? And this was when this disease was in its infancy, and it was often fatal, and the treatments weren't anywhere near what they are today. So I remember just being like very afraid of this illness in general. And then of course the other layer to it is there's like homophobia to it, right? When it was first discovered, it was in the primarily found in gay men, so they called it GRID, gay-related, I forgot what that I is, but disease, immunodeficiency disease. And for a long time, this community, the gay population, was sort of left on their own, you know, like Reagan was very slow to reach out in any meaningful public health way. And so you saw, and this is also when you've got the moral majority who's already got it out for the gay community, who's latched onto this as like, you know, another like weapon. So you have things like this. This is from the Moral Majority newsletter, talking about AIDS and homosexual diseases threaten American families. You know, look at this wholesome American family with their masks on, trying to stop a, you know, like bloodborne illness. But it was part of this like anti-gay propaganda. And I think younger generations saw community suffering and kind of, you know, became empathetic and started to kind of question what we were seeing and what we were seeing the government do and help or not. And another element to that is the dating aspect, right? A lot of our parents lived through the swinging 60s. There's a quote from Austin Powers that I think is like perfect. He's unfrozen from the 1960s, right? And he's like, as long as people are still having lots of anonymous sex with many partners, I'll be sound as a pound. You're like, no, not anymore, you know? So the sexual revolution like peaked. Our parents had all the fun, and then we come of age in a dating environment where there's this, you know, silent killing disease spreading through, and so the idea that, you know, whoever you form a relationship with might pass on an illness that could kill you really like put a cramp in a young person's dating life as they were coming of age. And one of our survey respondents said, there's a scene in Reality Bites where one of the characters goes and gets an AIDS test, and she said, like, yeah, that was a thing, that was real, you know, that's a real moment of anxiety in people coming up. So like cramping the way that you form intimate relationships and experience yourself as a young person just coming into sexuality. Now we'll take a quick buzz through clothing. We featured the fashions of the 70s, 80s, and 90s when Gen X was young. Anyone wear any of this? Can anyone remember the feel of polyester when it was like the thick, scratchy, you know, no stretch to it? Like, yeah. Yeah, 70s was just a bad decade. This guy's quote says it all. We were alive for the 70s, so all I can tell you is our clothing early on was horrific. So, you know, corduroy, bell bottoms, denim before they put stretch in it that you had to really struggle to get into. You had like the Little House on the Prairie kind of looks, or the bicentennial, you know, colonial girl looks, but you also had the like bohemian crochet kind of all mixing together with no rhyme or reason. And then we got into the 1980s. Did anyone have a perm? I had a crispy perm. My hair's really fine, so I was never able to like get the bangs very high. So this was like not the decade for me. But yeah, the acid wash jeans, the bright colors, the like, you know, sense of more is more, you know, bigger, bolder, more colorful, tight jeans. Yeah, like that woman's wearing there. And then, of course, with the 80s came the hair. Big, bold, crazy. And then the 90s, which just kind of had a more like mellow vibe. And the 90s are 100% back. Like I go to Target and look at the clothing section and it's like, oh, you're kidding me, right? Like the mom jeans that really like don't look good unless you're like 17 years old and weigh 100 pounds, you know? Like on a middle-aged mom, they like truly look like frumpy jeans, you know? But like, yeah, all the rugby shirts and everything is like completely back now. I just should have held on to my clothes from the 90s. And then in the exhibit, we also talked about computing. This is something that kind of blew kids' minds when they visited the Apple IIe, having to boot things up on a floppy disk. We had a video playing that talked about the internet in the 1990s when it was new. It was actually a like learn to use the internet VHS tape, and I forgot how boring the internet was. How pictures took a long time to load, and so it would either be like. Or you could turn off the pictures and just have like pages and pages of text, and it's like that caught on fast. And then we also had phones, and this is another thing that kids like really had their mind blown by. And phones were such an important part of a young person's life, right? Like I can remember calling my friends and talking to them, and when the phone rings, you get excited and want to pick it up because you don't know who's on the other line. And now I see a phone call, I'm like, you know, like I check my voicemail like once every 3 weeks. So I want to test do you have Gen X phone skills? You need a ride home and you don't have change for the payphone. How do you reach your parents?
Call them collect.
Call them collect, exactly. Or if you really want to game the system, you might place a collect call, and then when they say, who may I say is calling, you say like, can you pick me up at the mall? And then, you know, you don't have to have them accept the charges. Excellent. You see a payphone and you don't need to make a call. You check the phone anyway. What are you looking for? Change. Yep. Pagers were stereotypically associated with which professions?
Doctors.
That's awesome. Drug dealers and doctors. Your family's single phone is in the kitchen. How do you talk in private? Stretch the cord. Yes, exactly. Go around the corner, hide somewhere, stretch the cord. At what time do you make long distance calls and why? In the evening, yes. And I forgot what time it was, if it was 7 or 9 or whatever.
It's like 7 or 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yes, the whole like paying by the minute for phone calls thing is, I can remember my mom was from Norway, and so she would call her sister in Norway, and I can remember being at our community pool and my dad marching in with a phone bill, being like, "Wow, you've got a $300 phone bill!" And finally, I don't know if this reached as far down as Bloomington or if anyone is from the suburban Chicago area, but does anyone remember the number for Empire Carpet? Exactly, yes. That is some strong marketing right there. If 30 years later, you still remember the number. We talked about video games. Did anyone have an Atari system? And just the mind-blowing nature of being able to play a video game in your house. And we had one in our rec room that we fired up, and I was like, boy, this is hard and very basic, but at the time I can remember a neighbor having pole position and just blowing my mind. We talked about music and the cassette tape. Did anyone here ever make or receive a mixtape? On what occasion might you make a mixtape or receive a mixtape? Boyfriend, yes, the tape of love songs. What else? Did anyone have a friend's tape that you give to a good friend? I got one on my 16th birthday where all the songs had a theme of driving. Oh, yeah. And there's something of the era, there's nothing like the mixtape. I remember when you could burn CDs that wasn't the same, and now you can have a Spotify playlist, but there's something about actually sitting there with a dual thing and timing it just right, or trying to tape the song off the radio and not get the announcer's voice in there.
Well, that was another way you got to know new music, too. That was another way you got to know new music, too. Your friends would make these tapes for you. You'd be like, oh, I love that. I'm going to go out and buy that. And they would have something different. You'd give them something different. So it was another way to expand your knowledge of that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
I was very much into music.
Absolutely, yeah. That's how I learned a lot about music, was getting a mixtape. It's oh, never heard this song, but that's cool. I guess that was the end of my talk. So I'm going to end with a plug. We are starting a Route 66 oral history project. So if anyone has memories of Route 66 in its heyday up until about 70s or whatever, or know someone who does, I hope you will email me. We're hoping to do short oral histories, and it's a software that's pretty similar to Zoom, so it would be like a quick computer conversation. And beyond that, I hope you, if you're ever in the Lockport area, get a chance to see the exhibition. And I really appreciate everyone not just showing up, but sharing your memories here. This is always a fun conversation to have. So if anyone feels like sharing anything more, or talking or asking any questions, now's the time.
As one of the elders in here, I'll throw you, from a boomer perspective, yes, we were latchkey kids. You got home from school, you're 10, you're peeling potatoes, you're out picking the beans, you're doing whatever. So while we were latchkey, it wasn't unstructured because you had to have things done in time, and so it was a different experience. So I think we didn't learn that you had free playtime to do things, you just kept working. And I think that sort of is a difference even today, that you just expect that of yourself, that you will keep working through to get things done, and you structure your day accordingly. And I can kind of feel that difference, that some people don't, it's a sort of a generational thing. But yes, we were latchkey, but the different, what you did as a latchkey was you had work to do. But you can't have the dinner done if you start 10 minutes before, so you've really Yeah. Right, and you've got homework to do in the evening, so if you put something else off, you're cooked. Right, yeah. So it's just a perception.
You know, we were talking about the AIDS crisis and everything else, and it was like a lot of people, it was a scary thing that you never experienced and you didn't want to experience. But then I remember knowing people who had it and going to, there's an organization called ACT UP, and going to different places to take meals to people who were sick. And it was like you were really enmeshed in it as far as like it just being the scary, you know, it was still scary. Of course, you had to take care of yourself, but it was just, it was terrifying to think of your friends dying, and just right there, it was such a real thing. It didn't feel like the boogeyman, it was crazy. And, there were so many organizations that were protesting Reagan's coverage of the AIDS crisis and everything else and how he was treating it at the time. So, yeah, I remember that was such a scary time and a big time. Now it's amazing to think of the medications that they have, and it's just something you live with now. It's so weird. I think about it sometimes, like the huge difference and what they've done, the steps that they've taken, but that's all.
Yeah, no, it's
Sorry.
a point, and I think a lot of the protests and the reaching out.
Any other comments or questions? Oh, we have an online one.
We've actually had quite a few comments online while you've been talking. So someone said that they were the remote control for the TV for years. Someone called out the Buggles. Someone said Headbangers Ball was the favorite MTV show. And someone said once MTV started playing African American artists, I watched it more. So
That's awesome.
My best friend in college started teaching, it was the mid-'80s, so she was in her mid-20s, teaching high school at a Catholic school, and she used to bring in a ruler to measure the hair that was, how far up it was sprayed, and she'd have a little contest, for the students about who had so yeah, that was pretty.
Oh, sorry, my microphone died. That's a great story. Okay, yes. Okay.
Yep, for the online, yep, it's the rule.
I'm just wondering, I haven't heard anybody say anything about going to the movies, and I'm wondering how much maybe going to the movies was a part of your lives and what your favorite movies were. Now it's declining in people's, the whole technology and everything streamed, and it's declining at the same time. The number of movies people can watch is exploding. But I'm just wondering if going to the movies on dates or going to the movies with your friends was a big part of Gen X. And if so, what movie?
Goonies never say die.
Yeah, it didn't make it into the talk, but we did have a little section in the exhibit about movies, and Gen X was actually brought up in the era of the summer blockbuster. So from Jaws on to Raiders of the Lost Ark to Empire Strikes Back, it was really kind of this golden era of movies that I think people are recycling now. You've got so many remakes and sequels today of the classic content, but yeah, I remember I grew up in suburban Chicago, so it was what do you want to do? Do you want to go find something to eat, see a movie, rent a movie? That was so on the one hand, going to the movies, and we had a dollar theater, so I saw Forrest Gump 6 times in the theater because I loved it, and I just kept going back and watching it over and over. It was a good way to kill a Saturday. But then the VHS also had a okay, you have someone over and rent a movie if you're on a date. Or when I was little, it was like a sleepover, and the big thing is to rent Labyrinth and watch it at a sleepover, or Ghostbusters. So I would say it was huge, at least in my suburban experience. Did anyone want to add to that?
I just remember the Outsiders and Grease were really big. They were huge. I saw the Outsiders so many times. S.E. Hinton. I'm like, oh my God, they're so cute. Right? Yes.
Okay.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. For those of you who are here in the room, we do have a few display cases on the first floor of our Gen X items from the museum's collection. So please feel free to stop by. And for those at home, next time you're here at the museum, I know those display cases are going to be up for a little while, so please stop by. I have on good authority, there's an Atari down there with some fantastic games on display and a Barbie and Troll dolls. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to having you at our next program.